Good evening, and welcome to the Dallas Architecture Forum's panel discussion entitled Towards a Resilient and Emerging Megaregion. I'm Jean Udaly with the Forum, and we're delighted that you've joined us this evening for this important conversation. The Forum is grateful for our panel season sponsors for their support of this evening's presentation. They include Bentley Tibbs Architect, Galaxy Modern, Purdy McGuire, Robin Mentor Design Associates, Turner Construction, and Walter P. Moore. We're grateful for our forum members. If you need to renew your membership or join for the first time, please go to dallasarchitectureforum.org. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nate, who will introduce our moderator. Nate?
Thank you, Jean. Brett Bell is the director of the School of Architecture and a professor at the University of Texas at Arlington's College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs. Since 2014, Brett has also directed the Digital Architecture Research Consortium at UT Arlington, which is a group of industry and academic partners working to integrate advanced digital technologies and material applications into innovative building solutions. In 2015, Professor Bell was awarded the UT Arlington's President's Medal of Teaching Excellence, and in 2020, he was awarded the Texas Society of Architects Award for Outstanding Educational Contributions. Brett serves on the boards of AIA Dallas and AIA Fort Worth. He is also a board member and the chair of the Lecture Programming Committee for the Dallas Architecture Forum. We're grateful that Brad is organized and will moderate this important panel, so please join me in welcoming Brad along with our panelists, Kay Curtis, Mark MEYER, Ron STELMARSKI, and Meghna TARE as they begin our program. Welcome.
Great, thank you, Nate. All right, good evening and welcome to this evening's panel entitled Towards a Resilient and Emerging Megaregion, subtitled Lessons on Sustainability and Infrastructure in the Built Environment of North Texas. So if I could, I'm gonna give a brief introduction and then introduce our panelists and let them do their presentations, which I think we're all excited to hear tonight. But first, I would just say, against the backdrop of the Global Climate Summit taking place in Glasgow right now, we can see the complexity of how hard it is to get everyone to come together and talk about the problems that we're facing. And as we, I think, circle a little bit closer to home and look at this in our own region, here in the metroplex in North Texas, we're confronting a range of issues such as pollution, aging infrastructure, housing diversity, environmental responsiveness, and even climate change, all against an ever-increasing rapid population growth. Tonight's panel will bring together a range of experts sharing some of their strategies for looking at these complex issues within our ever-increasing and changing region. So let me start off by just introducing our panelists before they present, and then at the end we'll do a Q&A and then ask our audience to also provide some questions. But let me start off by introducing Kay Curtis. Kay Curtis is an architect and design fellow, fellowship team member at HKS, where she also works in the HKS hospitality practice with experience also in healthcare. Kay has worked on research studying the global pandemic impact on hospitality industry, and she's currently as part of the team that leads the HKS internal thought leadership for the design fellowship. Mark MEYER is a principal and board chair at TBG. As a principal at TBG's Dallas office, Mark has more than 20 years professional experience encompassing all aspects of landscape architecture and planning. He serves as chairman of TBG's board of directors, providing strategic guidance to continuously elevate all aspects of TBG's practice and corporate culture. Mark's diverse experience includes several projects throughout North Texas, including 5 Mile Creek, Urban Greenbelt in Dallas, MEYER Vera Calvin Plaza in Burleson, Playground Adventures in Grand Prairie, and Hometown in North Richland Hills. Ron STELMARSKI is the design director and principal at Perkins Will, Ron received a Master's of Architecture from Yale University and a Bachelor of Architecture from University of Cincinnati. And recent projects include the Pittman Hotel, the Baylor Scott and White Health Administration Center, the Lubbock City Hall, Singing Hills Recreation Center, and Fair Park Master Plan update. His inventive work interprets culture and context, elevating the public realm and galvanizing communities with architecture of enduring aesthetic, environmental, and social value. And Meghna TARE is Chief Sustainability Officer at UTA. As UT Arlington's first Chief Sustainability Officer, Meghna TARE works collaboratively to foster partnerships among academic, research, and operational departments at UT Arlington and to address opportunities to promote sustainability in several areas, including energy efficiency, transportation, education, outreach, and community engagement. She launched the Regional Center for Expertise for Education and Sustainable Development Goals in North Texas, a program for the United Nations University and the Institute for Sustainability and Global Impact at UT Arlington. So megaregions are networks of metropolitan centers and their areas of influence linked geographically in geographic proximity and shared environmental concerns and social, cultural, and economic ties. And our megaregion is typically understood as the San Antonio, Austin, over to Houston and back to Dallas-Fort Worth area. As we understand the Dallas-Fort Worth area and North Texas as being part of an even more specific ecosystem, it's the rapid expansion over the past decade that has forced us to take on the unique challenges that were mentioned earlier in terms of the infrastructure, pollution, climate, and housing that make these even more acute. What becomes unique compared to maybe some of the other areas within our megaregion is how we begin to understand the complexity of North Texas relative to how we begin to define it as no longer just something that is defined by the traditional centers of what we understood in the 1950s as two predominant centers of Dallas and Fort Worth, now with over 140 municipalities that have expanded well up into the North Texas region. We can begin to understand that there's a number of different ways that we define the context of the area that we occupy, and how we begin to communicate and coordinate around these issues becomes increasingly more complex. There are many examples, though, or growing number of examples of how megaregions and regions facing similar issues have started to find ways to coordinate and communicate. They find certain drivers, economic, social, and environmental issues that become coordination points that lead to very important resolutions that can become pivotal for how they move forward. We might have thought of these as traditionally being just transportation or even resource specifically around water, but now these are becoming much more multivalent in terms of how we can understand these, leading to things around jurisdictional governance, management relative to development, transportation infrastructure, green infrastructure planning, regional cooperation, and even revenue sharing. I would also like to point out that in some ways, this panel represents a continuation of attempting to bring together many different disciplines to talk about these issues, pointing back to the Future Cities Livable Futures Conference that started back in 2019, where the notion of watershed urbanism really started as a concept where we were bringing together folks from across North Texas and Dallas-Fort Worth to begin to initiate a conversation. And then in some ways that produced the work that is now on display at the Venice Biennale that I think will come up tonight from some of our panelists. And then that work will come back and start to tour throughout the region in Dallas and Fort Worth, Arlington, Louisville, and then again lead to several studios back at the School of Architecture for us at UTA, and finding continuity and consistency because we know that given the complexity of these issues, that persistence is absolutely critical. I think what's important is that probably we hear from our panelists, the experts that are leading the charge, and their work specifically within their firms and their organizations is absolutely critical as setting forward work that is foundational in terms of what we can see as leading thought leaders within the area. What I would say is that if you have questions that come forward during the presentation, please put them in the chat window. And then at the end, we'll pick those up after we've had some interaction amongst the panelists. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kay Curtis and let her start us off. Thank you very much.
Hey everyone, it's a pleasure to be on this panel today and have the chance to speak about such an important topic in our region. I'm going to be focusing on something that has been a huge part of the work I've been doing at HKS, and that's the connection between the location of our infrastructure, floodplains, and communities of color, and how we can leverage our future infrastructure systems for social and environmental justice. Our infrastructural systems like highways, industry, waste storage, and water systems support the function of our society. We put a ton of investment into building and maintaining it, and our infrastructure has a vast impact on the environment. The state of Texas alone has dedicated over $23 billion into water infrastructure alone over the next 50 years to keep up with our booming population and our uncertain future of water availability. When we see these images, we see something that might not be beautiful, but we know that it's necessary. Next. But we don't see the people who are living in the shadows of these massive projects. Here are 4 such communities in the Dallas area. You have South Dallas, which has been cut off from the rest of the city by multiple highways. Floral Farms has been infiltrated by multiple industrial plants and dumping grounds, including the infamous Shingle Mountain. Sand Branch is next to a water treatment center, and Joppy is next to the McComas Bluff landfill and industrial land. You might ask why someone would choose to live next to a landfill or a concrete plant. But the reality is that these neighborhoods were already there. Through laws, intimidation, violence, and practices like redlining, communities of color have historically been forced to live on the least valuable land in our cities. And some of the least valuable land you can find is a floodplain. All 4 of the neighborhoods on this screen are located partially or fully in the Trinity River floodplain. Now, if you're a municipality looking to build a piece of critical infrastructure, you're going to build it on the cheapest land you can find and in a place away from residents who might have a bigger say at the next election. Now, there's a huge piece of infrastructure being built in the middle of a community of color, in the middle of a floodplain, which also happens to be some of the most sensitive yet critical parts of our ecosystem. And it's disrupting water flows, pumping pollutants into the air and water, removing trees, and in many cases dividing neighborhoods and destroying businesses with uncrossable walls of concrete. So, let's recap. We, as a society, pushed communities of color to live in and near floodplains. Then we built our critical infrastructure on top of them. That critical infrastructure further devalued their land, making it harder for them to afford to move somewhere else. Now they're forced to live in the areas most at risk to climate change, and they have to deal with the health, psychological, environmental, and economic impacts of living next door to infrastructure. On top of everything, these neighborhoods typically have the least representation at all levels of government, are the most at risk from all environmental threats, and benefit the least from infrastructure. For example, the community of Sand Branch is next door to a wastewater treatment facility, but they don't have clean water. Next. So what do? We still need infrastructure to function for our society to function. There's 2 main goals that I would like to talk about. One is designing our infrastructure to function as part of multiple systems, and 2 is designing our infrastructure to be an asset to the surrounding communities. I don't have time to go into depth about all 4 of these projects, but each of them envisions an infrastructure that does both of these things. On the top, we have 2 projects that are starting to right the wrongs of this process and signify a shift in the way that DFW is thinking about infrastructure and urban planning. On the left, we have the Southern Gateway Park, which is currently under construction and will bridge 2 parts of Oak Cliff that were previously divided by a highway. On the right, we have Floral Farms Park, which we presented the concept design for last month, and will eventually replace the Shingle Mountain with a neighborhood park. The bottom 2 are more of dream projects that were part of our Venice Biennale exhibition with UTA. They both accomplish the two goals and push for a much brighter future for our infrastructure design. The one on the left is in Sand Branch, and it converts an abandoned gravel quarry into a water filtration center that also serves as a community hub for residents. The right, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, proposes the use of constructed wetlands for water filtration and storage along the Trinity River, helping to restore polluted areas of the Great Trinity Forest and create recreational green space for Joppy and other residents of Southern Dallas. Next. So the first thing we want to do is move past designing our infrastructure to only perform its function. We are investing a lot of money into building these interventions. We should be looking for ways to leverage that investment into something that does more. The utilitarian functions that each infrastructural work has been individually designed to perform doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's part of a greater system of systems. As architects, it's our job to see how our building systems can work together to create a better place. We should be treating infrastructure with the same mindset. I'll use our Great Trinity Wetlands project as an example. Most of North Texas's water storage is in the form of surface water reservoirs, or man-made lakes. These have several issues, inefficiencies, and a negative environmental impact. On the other hand, constructed wetlands not only eliminate these inefficiencies, but we found can be used for additional benefits like growing food, filtering pollutants, and providing habitat for native species. We paired them with other infrastructural systems like composting and energy generation in order to leverage multiple connected pieces of infrastructure to support each other and improve efficiency overall. Next. Once we've ensured that our systems are optimized, we can focus on designing the experience. Our infrastructure should enhance the quality of life of the people living nearby. How can we design these spaces at a human scale, make them inviting and good for people and local businesses? Instead of gray infrastructure, which contributes to urban heat island effects and disrupts wildlife, we should be pushing for green infrastructure, which recognizes that natural environments, plants, and soil are important assets with greater benefits than concrete can ever give us. In our project, the constructed wetlands became a place for people to relax and connect with nature. It also provided space for local businesses to thrive. Infrastructure doesn't have to be concrete masses that we push to the edge of town. It can be a natural greenscape where people and nature come together to support each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Kay. Next up, we have Mark MEYER.
Thank you, Brad. I'm excited to be here tonight, and thanks everybody for listening in. Such a critical topic that we're going through here within the DFW area and the entire United States. So I'm here tonight. I'm going to talk about the 5 Mile Creek Greenbelt Corridor Plan. And I wanted to start with this slide. And I think this slide really starts to sort of sum up why we're here tonight. In 2017, the Trust for Public Land gathered a huge amount of resources and data and healthcare data to really understand not only within this area, but the entire city of Dallas, what are our most underserved populations. What this area describes right here in Southern Dallas is the areas where we have the highest rate of diabetes, the highest rate of blood pressure issues, heart death, and heart-related illness. This is also through study a food desert and a park desert, and one of the biggest areas that we lack public transportation. So really what this is, if you look at this, is one of the areas within town that we need the highest priority of help to really right the wrongs of the past and the areas that we've overlooked within the community. If you look at this slide right here, there's this green little sliver that goes through the red and the orange, and that is 5 Mile Creek. It really is the life-giving water or blood, I guess you could say, to this entire area. So what we're going to talk about tonight is really this green sliver that goes through Southern Dallas for about 10 miles. Next slide, please. So starting back in 2017, a process of community engagement started within Southern Dallas, and this was led by the Trust for Public Land, our firm, and other design professionals within this area. Over the last 4 years, there have been over 60 events that have been held to engage the public, so actually we're listening to their voice the entire time. There were some very inventive ways of how we're listening to their voices. One was through crime watch prevention programs that we partnered with the police department and really trying to understand what's happening within the community. We've gone into individual yards and planted trees through the partnership with the Trust for Public Land and the Trees Foundation. We have held health and wellness classes, and as of 2 weeks ago, we did yoga with the community group We've also looked at countless one-on-ones and Zoom interviews over the last year and a half because of the effects of COVID. Over this, over thousands of people had been reached in the Southern Dallas area. And what we've heard from them within the vision plan of the Greenbelt were three defining elements. One was designing for safety. When they looked at this and they looked at 5 Mile Creek, it's an area that they really have not discovered yet. And many of them were afraid to engage into it. So our vision for this project became designing for safety, environmental resiliency, and most of all, parks for all people. Next slide, please. I think one of the things also that it'd be really interesting if we could show a bunch of hands, how many actually believe this is in Dallas, Texas. This is 5 miles south of downtown Dallas, and it is unbelievable. It looks like we're in Austin or the Hill Country. This is the 5 Mile Creek Greenbelt. It is an area that runs 10 miles all the way through the southern part of Dallas. However, it has been really long forgotten by the people of Southern Dallas and the people of Dallas. Most people that we reached out to did not even know the beauty and the splendor of this creek existed within their own backyard. It was actually looked at as a conduit of water, a conduit of trash, and really an area, if you were to go, bad things would happen. So the perception of this creek corridor was completely opposite of what we wanted. Through this process, we came up with 4 action plans for the community by hearing their voices. One was having this act as an urban refuge and engagement to it. The other one was restoration. The third was research and finding institutional partners that could come in and help us with that research and education. And the last was recreation and health. And when we mean recreation and health, we really mean the engagement of this pristine corridor. Next slide. So this is one of the slides from the vision of the overall booklet. And one of the great things is that this vision was actually adopted by the city of Dallas 2 years ago. This was a multi-year process. It actually identified 4 priority areas for where new parks needed to happen, not only within the main greenbelt of the area, but the entire focus area of Southern Dallas. So this really became a calling card of an active transportation system that's not there right now. So between looking at the city's plans, the county's plans, and listening to the residents, this plan identified over 23 miles of new multi-use, multimodal hike and bike trails through Southern Dallas, not only within the Main Creek corridor, but also its secondary tributaries and its tertiary tributaries, and was worked really hard on getting people to the space and really prioritizing pedestrian movement over that. From that, there have been 4 new priority park areas that have been established. One of the overall goals with environmental resiliency within this plan was how do we treat and protect water and nature and biodiversity within this entire subregion. It was very important during the study that we looked at where our food and our park deserts were, which really gave that priority. Through that area, we also looked at our environmental restoration priorities. You know, one of the things that you'll notice with this creek corridor, even though it is beautiful, there's a ton of bank stabilization areas that are leading to massive amounts of sedimentation and erosion that actually run through the system and into the Trinity River, which have greater impacts and consequences from just what we see right now. One of the other strategies here was to work upstream and actually look at vegetation of how we can slow and cleanse the water. So a native and a natural vegetation overlay is going to be applied to this area. And one of the other ones was the advancement of education of the general public of the environment and the health of the corridors. Next slide, please. And lastly here, one of the things with the plan being adopted in 2020, we have seen some unbelievable results from this. So the Trust for Public Land obviously is partnering with the city of Dallas, and with this being adopted by the city and in their over parks strategy, one, we can create a project now that is available for bond dollars, potentially federal dollars, but most importantly, philanthropic partnerships. So over the last two years, $10 million has been raised in 24 months to help this plan go forward with the goal of another $5 million to be had within the next year. The most amazing result of this, as of now, we have taken over 125 acres of developable land that are within floodplain and associated land next to that floodplain out of development. And that will be over 125 acres of new parkland that will be developed by TPL and given over to the city of Dallas, which will create more equitable development patterns. Right now, the South of Cliff Renaissance Park is under construction. A ribbon cutting is supposed to be had within the next 2 or 3 months. What you see in front of you is the new Judge Charles Rose Park. It's under design and construction will start in early 2022. And then Woody Branch Creek Park, which is the largest of all, totaling over 80 acres, will go under master planning in 2022. So, you know, it's really great to see what has happened over the last 4 years and the amount of speed in which it's happened. And really, I go back to that first map, is prioritizing the idea of health and equity for the people within all of Dallas, and really knowing where those equity gaps are. We were able to really create a bunch of movement with that. I think one of the things that came from this plan is really understanding the importance that open spaces and parks should be considered as critical infrastructure. And I think Kay sort of hit it when she was talking about it. You know, open space and parks now are vogue. They should have been vogue for, you know, the last 200 years. Unfortunately, we've forgotten about that and we emphasized gray over green. You know, if you look at parks and open space, it's 50% cheaper to develop a natural system than it is a gray system. And it's also cheaper to maintain and more resilient to climate change. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions and comments and we'll be happy to answer those, but that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. All right, Ron STELMARSKI.
Thanks, Brad. Glad to be here. So good evening, everyone. With my 5 minutes, I'm going to run through really a focus on Fair Park and the surrounding South Dallas community. It's an area that we as a firm had sort of speculated on. And we had then gone back and did the official master plan update, and then were brought back and extended our speculation through the Biennale exhibit that Kay was talking about. Do I sound okay? I hear.
Yeah.
But what we found real quick was that this is a great place to study juxtapositions. We know that there's a lot of social environmental disparity. And so the idea of scarcity and abundance came to the foreground. You can see here, we titled this Spectacle and Substance. So on the left, we have big text on fire, this sort of spectacle of the spectacle. And on the right, we see really where the substance has been scraped away, where the homes of the community had been sort of turned over into asphalt and parking. So we really rallied around the idea that design can overcome disparity. Next slide. And so we actually early on, well before the master plan update was occurring, we conducted an internal competition to Perkins Will, and that's an annual international competition. I hosted the 2019 competition, and we set the site right outside of Fair Park. And so what we did was we gathered about 65 or 70 different visions of what could happen around Fair Park. As we all know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And the idea was for us to start a conversation with the community to really think about their, you know, what are the reactions? What's the commentary? How do we really go through a series of ideas that can unlock maybe future potential? And in fact, what was interesting about it, the top 4 winning entries were non-US participants. They were from our offices in London and Shanghai and Sao Paulo. So very interesting. Next. But as we got closer to Fair Park, we started looking at the facts. You know, we always take stock of what's really occurring here and what can we uncover through just understanding and listening to the site. So I think the first one in particular, oops, I think we jumped ahead. The idea that the park, you know, out of the 277 acres, over 200 are impervious. That right there sends off some alarms. And we also know that it's really sized for about a 5-year flood event, which occurs, you know, regularly these days. But looking at just the amount of water that's falling on the site and how that could sort of feed the people, so to speak, knowing that just bad water is affecting education, it's affecting health, and just the way we use water should be something that we can, you know, do better with and understand and recognize. On the right-hand side, you start to see us just mapping the floodplain on top of a newly configured set of topography lines, all with the Fair Park and neighboring community together. So next. Okay, Yeah, and this might be my favorite slide because this really takes into account, art, history, memory. The top two images on the left-hand side are paintings by Olin Travis, a sort of regional artist. This was done around 1936, and the title is East Texas of Today, Before and After the Discovery of Oil. They're both hanging inside the Hall of State at Fair Park, and they're colored paintings. These have been toned blue for the exhibit. But the idea at the top of pine trees and lumber and the cotton industry, and then this discovery of the largest oil field in the world, 1929. And as Willis Winters put it, this image represents the rush of progress towards rapid industrialization and urbanization. So with that, we saw it and we felt we should complete the cycle. So our image is on the bottom. It sort of riffs on all of this and becomes the sort of maybe the conclusion of living with the land, and the idea that maybe water is in fact a new industry, a new ecological infrastructure that can overcome the burden of petroleum and so forth. But on the right side, what you see is our strategies and how they started to look and feel. And you can definitely understand how the water is weaving its way through the site, but we developed something that was about a layered landscape. So it was natural and was built up through an architecture. We produced a shadow network. So it starts to create something dimensional, it's shaded, it's a systematized prefabricated architecture. And we really try to rally around an idea that maybe this could have no pipes. What if we were to uncover all the waterways in a productive manner so that it wasn't just about pushing it underground and shipping it downstream, but in fact taking advantage. And we really titled this part the hydrotherapy of the site. And you can see the two organizing elements of the water and the neighborhood. They come together, and hopefully the intention is to blur the line between Fair Park and the community because they've been so segregated and separated over time. Next. This slide is really just a snapshot about how we as Perkins Will and as a global design firm bring these principles to bear on the projects that we work on. So we have what's called the living design ethos, 5 principles, or we might call lenses that we look through and test all of our projects against these, so that we can ensure that, in fact, we're not just focusing on aesthetics or program and function or any one of these, but in fact, making it a holistic solution to all the projects. Next. This is just a wider view. So this shows how we have global affiliations here, partnering with the World Green Building Council, but also it's an internal accountability. We are holding ourselves accountable to ensure that this infrastructure and the idea of health and wellness globally through design does move from the idea stage into the actual building stage. Next. Now I'll end with a quick story here. You may know this story. It's Ascension Island. It's right in the middle of the Atlantic, about 1,000 miles off the coast of both South America and Africa. And you can research this online, but Darwin, when he was sailing through with the Beagle, landed here and saw this volcanic, really waterless desert of an island, and had come up with some ideas about planting, really putting trees at the top of the highest points of the island. They became something of a cloud catcher, bringing moisture in, and this has truly transformed. It created all these favorable conditions for other plants to grow. And what's nice about this is it's a great example that artificial ecosystems that we're all talking about can truly be something that can impact the long-term health and wellness of an environment. And when the land and the environment are healthy, typically the people are well on their way to being healthy. And so this is another dimension and an example of how we as designers can think creatively and have major impact on the global conditions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. All right, next, Meghna TARE.
Thanks, Brad. Thank you for organizing this panel. I'm an educator working at UTA, and I implement policies for the campus, but the community outside of the campus. So in the world of engineering, I do process transformation, not product transformation. And as you heard, Kay, Mark, and Ron talked about how the work that they have done to improve and integrate sustainability in the built environment. I work at UTA to integrate sustainability through education and policy recommendation and collaboration, which is the cornerstone of our strategic plan that we have on campus, where sustainable communities is a very strong theme, and Brad and I work on it a lot. So, at UTA for the last couple of years, we've been trying to understand, like Brad mentioned, the region is growing at a very rapid rate with doubling of the population to 7.2 million by 2050. And so we are going to have challenges, not just for land and the space or the green space, but, in water, energy, landfill sites, right? So how is UT Arlington positioned to help the community with that, right? After all, we create a $17 million impact in the North Texas region. UTA is the largest university in the North Texas region and the second largest in the UTA system, with more than 60,000 students and $125 million dedicated to research, right? So next slide, please, Brad. So here at UTA, what I try to do is I use the global framework, the UN Sustainable Development Framework. And like Brad mentioned, we are in the middle of COP26 negotiations, and climate change is a very strong focus. But I usually use these 17 goals to advance my work, be it built environment, be it policy making, energy efficiency, transportation, waste reduction, anything that impacts the community, right, within and outside the campus walls, right? So sustainable communities is a very strong focus for us. Climate change is a very strong focus. Life on land, zero hunger, good health and well-being, and quality education, right? These are some of the initiatives, that SDGs that are of importance to us. And most of the programs that we implement on campus are aligned with these SDGs. And I'm going to give you examples of 2 of these programs, which might be of interest to you. Next slide, please, Brad. So as Brad mentioned in the beginning, UTA launched a regional center of expertise for education on sustainable development. This was launched in 2019. It is an initiative which is adopted and recognized by the United Nations University based in Japan. And to give you an idea, there are 179 RCEs, regional center of expertise, across the world. 179, there are only 8 in the US and only 1 in Texas, which is launched at our office at UT Arlington. So we are really at the forefront of advancing sustainable development in the communities using the global framework, right? And so this is an initiative where we have engaged with public-private partnerships, over 70 different partners in the region. For example, Arup is a partner in this initiative. We have BNSF, Schneider Electric, Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, City of Dallas, City of Plano, North Texas Food Bank, variety of organizations who are working with us under this regional center of expertise to focus on these 3 SDGs for the region, right? SDG 11, sustainable cities, SDG 3, good health and well-being, and SDG 4, quality education, right? So the Watershed Urbanism conference that was hosted in 2019, we partnered with CAPPA on that. RC North Texas was an applicant to the NSF funding, which we got to host that Urban Shed conference. And we actually submitted that project to the United Nations University for an award. And we actually received an award for a flagstone project under SDG 15, Life on Land. So we got officially recognized by the United Nations University as a project that is advancing sustainable development goals in the region. We are also working with a nonprofit organization called Trinity Coalition based on Fort Worth, where we developed a water quality report card for the Trinity River, which we have presented to COG and Texan by Nature, the Laura Bush Foundation. And we are actually expanding the scope of the program by applying for some funding because it was so well received. Nobody had ever developed a water quality report card for the Trinity, right? So critical project. A couple of other projects going on, like reducing food waste through at the Wiley ISD with the North Texas Food Bank. And earlier this year, we hosted a big annual summit with more than 200 participants and keynote speakers, including the UN Secretary General for the Satya Tripathi and the UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Development. So really putting North Texas on the map in terms of advancing UN Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please, Brad. And the second initiative that we launched earlier this year is the North Texas Food Policy Alliance. So Kay and Mark, they both talked about social equity and environmental justice, right? So that is a cornerstone of this initiative as well, because the pandemic put forward the need of equitable and resilient food systems for not just the entire world, but also for North Texas. And so we've launched this North Texas Food Policy Alliance. Again, it is a partnership of over 40 organizations in the region, including Tarrant Regional Water District, Tarrant Food Bank, Policy Council, North Texas Food Bank, North Texas Commission, and a couple of other organizations who are working with us to address the equitable food systems for North Texas. And this is mostly done through education, collaboration, and partnerships. For example, we have applied for a USDA funding to conduct a regional food assessment study for the region. You know, what are the gap analysis? Who's providing funding? What do we need to advance that in the North Texas region? And this includes engagement with a lot of faculty and staff on campus who are researching to address the challenges of the world of agriculture, including supply chain problems, right? And on September 15th, we hosted a summit because this is the year of the Food Summit, and the UN hosted the Food Summit in September. And we hosted this as part of that contributing dialogue to the Biden administration, where we collected thoughts from keynote speakers in the region and drafted it into a policy paper that is going to be shared with the Biden administration to be integrated and adopted into their food policy agenda for the US. And we had speakers from the American Heart Association and the North Texas Food Bank to talk about the challenges that they are facing for the region. So, you know, I would highly encourage, if anybody's interested in being a partner, there's no cost associated, there's no paperwork, there's no agreement, it's just your time and enthusiasm to be part of a collaborative network in the North Texas region. So thanks, Brad.
That's great. Thank you very much. Wonderful presentations by all of our panelists. Let's see if I can get us back to our title slide here. Actually, I'm going to go to just right there for a second. And while I'm doing that, I would invite our audience, if they have questions, to go ahead and submit them into the chat window. You know, as our panelists know, I sent them a whole long list of questions that I was going to roll out here, and I'm probably, for the sake of time, going to narrow that down to just a couple, and I want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time for our audience as well. Wonderful projects and ways in which we're interacting in the region. Both current projects, speculative aspects of things that are going on. We touched on, I think, some amazing things that are happening in terms of social equity and agency, things that I was really interested in hearing. How are we working? Things that are coming up in terms of what are the organizational aspects of how we're coming together and working across some of the complexity of the region itself. And so I think that that's definitely some of the highlights that I'm seeing come out from what we're presenting. I guess what I would be interested in hearing from you is, you know, just to start it off, what is it that we're not talking about yet, and what is absent from our conversation? If you step back, obviously you're change agents within your own space. But you're doing that, and you probably have those around you that have joined you in that call. But if you step back and you look at the organizations that you either have seen that you're historically been a part of, you know, or that we are needing to also come aboard in terms of making some of this change, I feel like sometimes it's a battle of inches in terms of some of these conversations. I guess I'm wondering what's absent from the conversation as you as thought leaders begin to step back and look at this.
Brad, I can start that off. I have a
please.
For you. I think one of the things that I find is a disconnect is that as designers and educators that are probably on this call, is that we all understand where we're going, but I think there is a huge disconnect with the general public. A lot of my work has to do within new development, and when you go to a city, the council may want to do the staff may want you to do it one way, but the city council feels that maybe bigger is better and disconnected is better. So I feel that there is a general lack of public education about the process of sustainability and what it means to development patterns and development forms and protection of our natural resources. it is immensely tough to work in one of our municipalities and talk about walkable communities, mixed use communities. So I think that if we look at a region, that is probably one of the biggest obstacles we have of really trying to create much better development form and pattern.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, in researching some of this notion of the kind of hair shirt mentality where everyone feels like the resistance here is that they're going to have to suffer in order to even engage, right? That it's all about sacrifice before we can even get to the starting line. I'm wondering if others on the panel have seen ways in which you're either working with the community, because I love the fact that all of you are engaged in this conversation, either locally with your design community and your office community, or in the public, right? In terms of providing agency, how are you overcoming that aspect where it's not exclusively premised on that we can, that the outcome is exclusively based on sacrifice, right?
Yeah, I'll take real quick a response to that, and also dovetailing into a question that was asked about how do we make, move from vision to execution. And I think that's exactly the big question I think we all have, is creating vision, but also balancing that with value. And that's a big piece, like you said, Brad. It's not about sacrifice, but it's how do we transform the singular nature of each of these pieces of infrastructure or architecture or whatever it is, overlap them to create some real sort of interesting alchemy, something that's almost unexpected that will evolve into something that is truly productive. And that's why we start out, I mean, we're the role I'm in as an architect and a designer, I can really only use the vision and then develop a level of proof of concept. And that's why a lot of what you've seen is speculation, it's experimentation, it's really trying to push that out there. But I think that going back to the other question about execution, that's where we're sort of struggling. What's missing could be that sort of the edges. As designers, we don't have ultimate influence in terms of policy making. And so we can get involved, but then at the other end of the spectrum, we need to go for zero carbon in the building industry now. I mean, if we talk about just making the environment better as an architect, as a lot of us as designers, we really need to make that change now. And that's at the level of craft and really building blocks of our communities. So I think there's the two really broad ends, and I do see myself as an architect being closer towards the building block role, but having the backup and the sort of framework that's somewhere like a Perkins and Will has, where we are globally connected. We're trying to have lessons learned from all parts of the world. And again, it's a value proposition. And what we're seeing is a lot more developers and other decision makers understanding the value proposition, whether it's through ESG and the notion of a reputation score. But these are just like the way LEED came about. We understood that for certain big corporations, they would have to have a LEED space. It had to be sort of certified before they would actually release that space. So the same thing now, making things marketable, the ESG score has to be high, or the environmental footprint, the carbon footprint may have to be reduced. So that's where we are making a difference. But again, we have to implement at the ground level.
I have a kind of a bit of a response to that. I think the scores and all of these numbers that we're kind of assigning kind of comes with a mindset that's a bit of a part of capitalism, and kind of the idea that we're all competing against each other and that we have scores that we need to settle. And something that us as designers are pushing forwards that I've seen in my education and in HKS is that we're trying to find ways to come together and understand that we're all kind of part of the same system and our decisions impact someone else's. But I think that hasn't necessarily translated to our client side with the developers. It's still, they see it as a sacrifice. When it's not a sacrifice, it's a trade-off, and understanding how what you're doing now is going to benefit you and everybody else in the future, instead of giving you an immediate benefit in the short term.
Yeah. And I can quickly add to that, Brad. I think what we need is a systems thinking perspective, right? Everything is part of the puzzle. And so operating in silos doesn't really serve anyone, because ultimately all those ideas, all those projects, all that work is going to converge at some point. And so having that buy-in from everybody, you know, we don't have to sacrifice, it's for the good of all, but also how do you fit in the bigger picture, right? Thinking outside of the bubble of Texas, you know, how do you fit in the bigger picture in the scheme of things actually helps drive some of that conversation without having to really convince people that this is good for you. So I think that systems thinking really, really helps in the long term.
I agree with all that. I think one of the things that we also need to look at, it's not only about the building, it is about the landforms, it is about the connections, it's about our natural systems. And if you look at what our municipalities are doing right now, that is completely disconnected. And it's not like we have one city to prove that to. We have 140 cities that we have to prove that to. And that is very hard to prove it to the city, to a client. And those are all very, very disconnected. So, you know, this idea of sprawl is the worst thing that is happening to us right now. And as an industry, we have to get ahead of that. And I think that is our biggest challenge, is how do we get ahead of that notion that the next city that is going to be gobbled up on the toll road does not go in a form of all 50-foot lots that are disconnected from retail and there's no walkability and they turn their back to their natural resources. That is the biggest challenge that we have as a region, that we can't get anybody on the same page with that.
Yeah, and I think, Mark, you brought up in a conversation that we were having that really the lack of geographic feature that creates points of resistance actually works against us in that regard, because it doesn't then create moments of reversing density back into the equation, right? I mean, we're kind of so wide open that we just continue to expand, right? We don't bump up against a mountain range, a landform, a body of water in any real point of resistance. And so we're just wide open in that regard.
All we have is the Red River.
Right. Keep on going, right? Exactly. So, we have a couple of questions that have come in that I want to throw out to this group, since we've got such great experts, to make sure that we're touching on some of these questions. Shada Nemery has posted, says, thanks so much for a great presentation in terms of infrastructure. How is the region dealing with broadband availability and digital divide to poor areas like South Dallas?
I can talk about that. North Texas Innovation Alliance, Jennifer Sanders and her team are working to address that issue, and they have really a couple of good projects going on. So please check out the North Texas Innovation Alliance and what they are doing to bring broadband to South Dallas. And I'm happy to connect with Jennifer.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tough question, but again, it goes back to the fact, like for Fair Park, we had a very charged situation between the public and the private entities, and going in with dozens of visioning sessions and listening to the community, Wi-Fi was at the top of their list. And so that message was brought loud and clear through that, you know, sort of just examination of what everyone needed. And so with the new park that's being done, Wi-Fi is a major piece of that. So it got its way, found its way into the budget very quick, because we were able to open up the conversation and allow the voices of those who use the space to have influence.
Yeah. Ross Duvall picks up on a question that I think we were kind of unpacking a little bit. Says the projects presented are extremely impressive and showcase a ton of potential to positively impact people's lives. But can you speak to what the biggest hurdles would be to moving from vision to execution? I.e., is it funding, inter-city communication, public knowledge? Some of these are actually, I think, Mark, you're saying you're breaking ground on some. Some of these are on the boards and looking to have future groundbreaking, but what do you all see as some of the inhibitors to these moving from project to reality?
I think in the case of the 5 Mile Urban Greenbelt is that it took a third party to jump in and do normally what a city would. I think if you look at our cities, they're so strapped from a fiscal standpoint, they're strapped from a manpower issue, is that they're not able to have the horsepower and capacity to make what they've traditionally do in the past. So in our case, we have the Trust for Public Land that stepped in as a basically partner with the city of Dallas. They've acted as sort of the funding agency, the agency of change, and the ones that sort of are pulling it all together. The great thing about them is that they're gonna pull off this vision one day, and that all goes back over to the city of Dallas. So the city of Dallas will be getting better in this area of town, but it's really taking somebody else to step in, because if you look at our city governments, we we are very compromised in a lot of issues because there's so many things that they're having to deal with, just like we have had to deal with COVID and all kinds of stuff that's happened over the last 18 months. Cities have had huge fiscal areas of problems, huge manpower areas. So I think it's looking for these other agencies to really play sort of a pseudo governmental place to help them move forward. And I think, Ron, that's probably similar to what you guys have on Fair Park.
Yeah. I want to throw out one more question, then just give you all a quick second to maybe wrap with any final thoughts. Mark Wolf asks, I think, a really valid and in some ways essential question about civilization seems to be dancing around this central issue of how much population can any one region, a continent, or even a planet truly sustain for centuries. Is any entity examining this? Have you seen any valid research? What if the planet can only realistically support 5 billion and not 10 billion? Do we need to start there in terms of what we're looking at?
Well, all I can cite is the research paper by Garrett Hardin, The Tragedy of the Commons, which talked about how something that's common to everyone gets ignored, and if we have to fix what's going on right now, I think the precautionary principle and the environmental dilemma and the tragedy of the commons go hand in hand in addressing some of the issues that we are facing.
Yeah.
It's a big question that will take another hour of panel discussion.
Just to ping on that, we've lost what 30% of our biodiversity over the last 80 years. We're part of that. Yeah. We'll be the last ones left, but it's the truth. We're part of biodiversity. And, it's got to hit home that we're just a part of the system. We're not the system. And I think people forget that we can engineer our way out of everything, and we truly can't.
We can't do that.
Yeah, I think the question isn't how many people this planet can sustain, but what are we doing to sustain our planet? Mm-hmm. That's really the answer. Good point, Kate.
We have just 1 or 2 minutes left to wrap up, and I would love to hear if you have any thoughts on what a healthy Dallas-Fort Worth, North Texas looks like in 2050, or if you have an example of what you feel like a region's already doing to head aggressively in that direction that we should be taking note of, right, as an example. So it could go one of two directions. What's aspirational for us as a vision, or what's an example of what you hope we're learning from in terms of some place out there that you want us to pay attention to?
I support UN SDGs as the framework to pay attention to going forward.
Absolutely.
I think trying to eat the elephant in one bite is impossible. So, to take baby steps, some things that I've really been intrigued with recently is the city of Austin and how they're looking at functional green in their draft code. It is looking at the integration of nature into their urban core, and what they're doing, they're offering developers density bonuses on making sure their site contains their biodiversity, their habitat, and also integrated public open spaces, not only at ground level, but throughout the entire building. So one of the things that you're seeing in Austin, I think we're going to see more in the future, is this lacing of landscape architecture and architecture vertically through the building with publicly accessible spaces. And I think we have to look at that as our cities get denser and taller and more, hopefully more connected.
What I see is really that we need to focus on improving the lives of the most at-risk people in our community, because if we're focusing on, diminishing the amount of risk that they have, it's going to trickle up and end up impacting all of us, and we'll all reap the benefits.
Yeah, clearly equity is a big issue. We know that poverty has increased about 42%, I think, in Dallas in the past 15 years. So again, that disparity is just it's mind blowing. I think we mint one of the highest number of new millionaires per year, and yet we have one of the highest levels of child poverty in the US. So how do you reconcile that? So it goes back to me, the Darwin example, where we can truly introduce, whether it's architecture or natural intervention, to create a system that goes back to a full cycle where it does become a holistic ecology. And I think that's what we have to strive for, is not thinking about buildings versus nature. It's entwining buildings and nature in a hyper-productive way. And again, there's too many threads here to follow. I mean, they all kind of come back together, and it's difficult to just tease each one out. But I sometimes look through the lens of what can I personally do, and then there's what's the aspirational that the commons can produce. So it's a trick, but I'm hopeful.
Well, I'm going to say I'm very optimistic, given just the nature of the conversation like tonight. The fact that we can get a group like this together and have this level of conversation continues to point in a positive direction. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the forum for allowing this conversation to take place. And really appreciate. Thank you to our audience for being in attendance.
Yes, I want to second that. Brad, Kay, Meghna, Mark, Ron, thank each of you for, I think, raising awareness of some major challenges. But again, each of you, especially panelists, talking about areas of their actions that are occurring to bring hope. So I think as we continue to work together, raising awareness, that we move forward. But again, major challenges, and need to keep this front and center. So thank you again. Thanks for all of you for joining us, and good evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.